Let's bring in our next guest. He has been with us often to discuss immigration and the inaction on national security and border security. He's Michael Cutler, former INS officer, Skyping in from New York. Michael, this story is so big, I don't want it to get lost. I think we need to concentrate on this. Give us the breakdown. As I understand, 2 of the Turks are still imprisoned in the United States, but the other 2 are in Canada, and apparently this Justice Department is not attempting to have them sent back here.
Well, it was an issue of whether or not they were going to be prosecuted. They had them in custody. If the U.S. attorneys were going to prosecute them for unlawful entry, and they could have, then they would have made the proper move to get them indicted and take them into custody for the purposes of prosecution. Apparently, an immigration judge was the worst they faced, and they were excluded from the United States. They were set for hearing for exclusion. For whatever reason, the judge allowed them to continue on their merry way, which makes no sense. And then you have to wonder, if they were known terrorists, why the no-fly list didn't prevent them from apparently taking an airplane to get them up to Canada, presuming that's how they got there. And final point, this again calls into the spotlight something that I've been saying for the longest time. It's not just the border that the United States has with Mexico that should concern us. It is the northern border. It is the coastline of the United States and our seaports, and it's also the international airports. These are all parts of America's border, and yet most of the politicians, including Republicans, JD, keep on talking about securing the southern border. You know, and I wrote an article for Front Page Magazine. I called it Border Security and the Immigration Colander. Think of how many holes there are in the system, how many ways of coming here, gaming the system, and yet everybody seems to be oblivious to it, with the exception of a couple of stalwart congressmen and senators.
I would compare it to Swiss cheese, but then I'm mindful of the fact that the Swiss actually control their borders, the holes in the cheese they make notwithstanding. You look back at this, and earlier this week on Capitol Hill, there was a public hearing. The Homeland Security Committee, Congressman Jason Chaffetz, grilling Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson on this entire episode, and the secretary sitting there blaming a U.S. immigration judge for the problem. Why doesn't Congress force someone in the executive branch to stand up and be held accountable?
I agree. Look, the judge, I don't know what was in the judge's brain. Maybe, he wasn't thinking right. I have no idea. But why weren't these people then prosecuted? Why was no appeal filed immediately to stop the judge from releasing them? You know, there is an appeals process that could have been invoked by the administration. So if you don't get the ruling you want, why not appeal the judge's decision as being reckless or contrary to national security? Wouldn't you think that that would be a reasonable course of action?
Only about a minute left in this segment.
Sure.
From all we have seen, in the parlance of the playground of bygone days, are we cruising for a bruising? This continued failure to deal with border security, is this just an open invitation for something terrible to happen?
Absolutely. You know, one of my nightmares is 9/11. I lived through it. 4.5 years before 9/11, I testified before a House Immigration Subcommittee on the dangers posed by visa fraud and immigration fraud. The Clinton administration ignored all of that. That's what set the stage for 9/11. When they keep saying the system is broken, look at all the terrorists who've since entered the United States after 9/11. Look at the Boston Marathon bombing. Look at the statements by ISIS. And I want those elected politicians to explain to the American people how they're looking out for the safety of our citizens and the security of the United States.
And it is a bipartisan failing. We can point that out. Michael Cutler, we're going to ask you to stay with us. We're going to step aside for a second. When we come back, the latest machinations on Capitol Hill dealing with the Obama amnesty. That's ahead on America's Forum. Let's continue our conversation with former INS officer Michael Cutler. So we hear that basically Congress is upset that the president took this unconstitutional action. 17 states have filed a federal lawsuit. While that's all well and good, does that basically allow the administration to go full speed ahead on this unilateral amnesty?
God only knows. But, I'd love to see part of that lawsuit being an injunction to freeze the president in place at the moment. But what really disturbs me, and I agree that he's creating a constitutional crisis, this purported constitutional professor, but how about undermining national security? So you've not heard that. And if you want to freak out most members of Congress, there's a very easy question that the viewers out there can ask their elected representative. If they favor comprehensive reform, how does it square with the findings and recommendations of the 9/11 Commission? It's a very simple question. It's a very reasonable question. Clearly, we're at risk. The news today was about an American teacher who was killed in the Middle East and about an American who's been taken hostage by al-Qaeda. Clearly, we're still at war with people who want to seek our destruction. They want to come here and kill us. So why in the world are we not hearing anything about the implications of what the president wants to do with national security? Process 5 million, and what if it turns into 10 or 15 million? We don't know what the numbers are. And provide everybody with an identity document without a face-to-face interview and without a background investigation. And I have to make the connection. Chuck Schumer, one of the biggest proponents for this massive disaster, just made a statement that anybody who trespasses on New York landmarks should be facing 5 years in jail to deter trespassing. Why doesn't he take that same principle and apply it to people who trespass on America?
The hypocrisy from Washington, D.C. is breathtaking. And Michael, we have mentioned it before. You are a registered Democrat. I obviously served in Congress as a Republican and maintained my membership in the Republican Party. But the wrong kind of bipartisanship has emerged on Capitol Hill. This drive to make a deal no matter what, or seemingly from the GOP leadership to say, oh, this was wrong, we'll pass a symbolic resolution that has no effect, and then continue to fund the government.
Yeah,
go ahead, sir.
I'm sorry. No, I was just going to say, you're right. I mean, it's astonishing. I call these people deconstructionalists. We keep hearing the news reports. Unemployment is still a huge issue. Forget that 5 point whatever number. It's probably closer to 30%. And look what it's done to the minority communities. It's catastrophic. Wages continue to decline. Sales were down this year on Black Friday. Well, this doesn't take rocket science. If you drive down the wages of American consumers, they have less disposable income. They're going to spend less money. We're in a death spiral being fired by this drive for globalism. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Zuckerberg and Gates in Silicon Valley, all of these individuals are pumping hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars into pushing comprehensive reform. I had the privilege of being with Jeff Sessions a couple of weeks ago, and I was in Florida with the David Horowitz Freedom Center. Sessions quoted me way back when in 2007, they tried to do this again, and I came to call comprehensive reform the Terrorist Assistance and Facilitation Act. And we really, as Americans, need to get a hold of our politicians, because you know what? I don't think too many people voted for the people they voted for. It's who they voted against. That might be the better question to ask people. Not who did you vote for, who did you vote against? People are unhappy with Congress. Here's the opportunity for some leaders to emerge and really look out for the American people in America. Wouldn't that be a novelty?
You mentioned Senator Jeff Sessions. If some action is taken in the House, do you expect Senator Sessions or a handful of others in the Senate who object to taking the floor, as we see Jeff Sessions here on the screen right now, to taking the floor to filibuster, to stop the funding for this? Because if they move forward at least 3 months, quite possibly funding on into September for Obama's amnesty. About 45 seconds left, Michael.
Sure. I can't speak for Jeff Sessions. I do know where the man's heart and soul are. I'll be honest, this is a plug for Jeff. I'd love to see him run for president. I'd get my first good night's sleep since 9/11. But I think that there are enough members of the Senate, Chuck Grassley, David Vitter, there are a few others who are so fired up, want to do what's right for America and Americans. And I heard the demonstrators, somebody yelled out, who's being protected and who's being served. Ironically, I wrote a similar commentary for Californians for Population Stabilization, capsweb.org, where I made that point. Who's being protected, who's being served by the current immigration disaster that's having such a heavy impact on us?
And that same Senator Jeff Sessions, in an interview to National Review Online, said that House Republicans are in jeopardy of violating their campaign promises. Michael Cutler, we thank you very much for your time, and America's Forum will continue.